All right, so this is very meta for everyone in multiple places at once. So, yep, I see that. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the Same Sun Happy Hour. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Dean Schwartz, for being here. My name is Britt Hines-Amborn, and I am moderating today's discussion. I'm not directly involved with any of the research today, but here because I know a little bit about the topic. And so I want to introduce Andrew Oslin. He is in his final semester of his Master of Public Affairs here at the Humphrey School. And he did spend his last summer in Israel working, interviewing different members of parliament in Israel, as well as members of NGOs that are engaged in working on the issue of human trafficking, and also has done a lot of archival research as well, and has become pretty passionate about the issue. And so we are going to have a presentation that'll last about 25 minutes of that is the culmination of his research, and then we're going to take some questions and engage in more of a discussion. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andrew.
Hi there to all of you who are online. I'm going to switch it to the presentation so that you guys can have access to it, and then I'll switch it back for the question and answer session. Like Britt said, it will be about 25 minutes of a presentation, then we'll take questions. We are going to be moderating the forum on YouTube. If you have questions, feel free to type in a comment there, and we'll make sure to get back to you.
Where they're from?
Oh, so I do know people that signed up for the live stream are from Israel. There's some from Africa, and then there's a few right around the US. So this is the first time for us here at the Humphrey School. Hopefully it goes well. And hopefully this works. Okay, so my presentation was trafficking in Israel, and my issue was to go through and figure out what are they doing. And throughout this presentation, you'll see that Israel is doing a lot of things they could do better, but I was interested in how Israel has fought it. If you know anything about the Trafficking in Persons report issued by the State Department, Israel moved from being one of the worst countries in the world to one of the best countries in the world in a period of about 10 years. You'll see here the agenda. And I wanted to give out some thanks to the Stassen organization, Sherry. They paid for my flight to Israel. The Jerusalem Institute of Justice, there was a man there named Eli Chazan who really helped me get into the Knesset meetings, Israel's parliament meetings. I spent a month and a half, I would say, going to meetings with Knesset members, NGOs, and Eli. And so I want to thank them. They've been very active in the court system. Assume Justice Works. They do a lot of work in trafficking advocacy, both in the community and in the Knesset. I met with a couple of their more notable representatives, and they gave me a lot of information on my topic, and they were a very good resource for me to where else I could find information. Kath Lamb, if you guys saw the flyer, she's the one who designed the flyer, which is great. And then Britt, she's cool. She does a lot of work with, well, I guess now you're still a student, but you do work with, she's in a class on global trafficking I was thinking of taking. I know she's passionate about trafficking. She does have a degree, is it a certification or degree? On sex, what is it? Sex trauma counselor? Certified Sexual Assault Crisis Counselor, so, which I think is interesting. So let me take you back to June of 2014, and I was just about to sit in my first Knesset meeting. Now I'm going to use the term Knesset, but it's really Israel's parliament. I'm going to go into my first Knesset meeting, and I'm just excited because I see this country, they're a tier 1 country, they're doing all these great things to fight trafficking. And it was with the British Foreign Ministry, and the topic was on what's called spoils of war, which I'll talk about later. But it didn't take long, and my jaw just kind of dropped, and my heart just kind of sank. As I'm sitting there, there's a Knesset member, her name's Aliza Levy. She says, "We have eradicated human trafficking in Israel." And I thought to myself, how can that be when there's over 280 brothels in Tel Aviv? Prostitution is legal in Israel. And how can you have legalized prostitution without having a trafficking problem? Second thing I noticed was that the average age of a prostitute in Israel was 13 to 14 years old. So you're telling me that 14-year-old prostitutes want to be involved in the sex trade? There was a statistic I heard while I was there that said 91% of prostitutes in Israel wish they were not in the field. They did not want to be prostitutes. So only 9% were doing it out of their own free will. That to me means that you're not doing it because you want to, you're doing it because you're forced to. Whether you're forced by a specific person or by an environment or by your personal situation, you're being forced to do it. So the first thing I thought to myself is, what has gotten us to this point? How does Israel have such a trafficking problem, even though they don't really seem to recognize it? Now, I'm going to take a step back and say they do recognize it. But when it comes to the international community, they kind of take a more aggressive, defensive stance because of a lot of different international factors. But there's really 6 big issues that I noticed that Israel is facing in their fight against trafficking. Now, for those of you who are here and on the YouTube video, I'm going to do more in-depth videos over the next month and a half on these 6 topics. But to keep this presentation brief, I'm just going to highlight the 6 and go on from there. The first one is religious extremism. There were 2 forms of religious extremism that really caused trouble in Israel. The first one being Jewish extremism, the second one being Islamic extremism. On the Jewish side, there's a verse in the Torah that says when a woman's on her period, she can't have sex. The husband, thinking it's his right to have sex in some of these more ultra-Orthodox communities, they will go hire a prostitute while their wife is on her period. And they say that it's okay because the rabbis have told them, as long as I give them money for the service and tell them I don't have account for you, I'm not married to you, that it's okay for them to use prostitutes. In Islam, the issue is that if you're a girl and your dad or your brother rapes you, now not all of Islam, this is ultra extreme Islam. If you're a girl and your brother or your dad rapes you, it's your fault. You did something to provoke them to be sexually interested in you. And then the result is you usually get killed or you get kicked out of the house. If you get kicked out of the house, well, you're not worth anything because you're not a virgin. So you probably go try to find a brothel, or you may try to go to Israel. Because in Israel, you may not be treated very well, but at least you won't die. And so you end up having this refugee problem with people who have been exploited around the Middle East. So the second issue I noticed was immigration and refugees. Immigration really had to deal in the late 90s. There were thousands upon hundreds of thousands of Russians that immigrated to Israel. And there was a period of time where they didn't have to necessarily prove they were Jewish as long as they revoked their passport to Russia. Now, I'm not sure on all the details because there's a lot of complicated issues with it. But, and I'm pretty sure it was Russia that told them that they had to revoke their passport. So you had all these Russian mob figures going to themselves, hey, if I bring this girl to Israel and she says she's Jewish, then she doesn't have a passport to go back to Russia, she's kind of mine. And so there was a mass influx of the Russian mob and kidnapped girls into Israel who were then used as prostitutes. On the refugee side, and this is I love Israel, I support Israel, but this is a dark spot in Israel's history, particularly along the Sinai border before the fence went up. There were a lot of people who crossed the border or were forced to cross the border trying to get into Israel because they had such bad situations in Africa, in Egypt. And Israel sometimes would just deport them. If you know anything about Sinai terror camps, there were a bunch of camps along the Sinai border specifically to pick up these people that were trying to immigrate to Israel. Some of them by right. A lot of Ethiopians got caught on the border between Egypt and Israel. And what they would do is they'd rape and beat the Egyptian terrorists. Now, not the Egyptian government. They didn't sponsor this, but it was very hard to find. So Egyptian terrorists or Bedouin tribes would pick up these women and children particularly, beat and rape them, and then send videos of them to their families and say, if you don't pay a certain sum of money, we're going to kill them. Sometimes they would kill them. Sometimes they'd throw them in the desert and push them into Israel. The reason of pushing them into Israel was twofold. Is one, they figured, well, maybe we can harm Israel's international reputation, but second, it'll be a drain on Israeli society and their funds. So the immigrant problem really wasn't addressed very well by Israel in the early days. They've made some significant changes now, which I'll talk about in a minute. So refugees, immigrants, and then this issue of spoils of war, which I briefly mentioned previously. A good example is the civil war in Syria. Now, you have the Syrian government and you have the anti-Syrian government factions that are fighting. So let's say you're the anti-Syrian faction, you take over a town. Well, your culture believes that it's your right when you take over a town to plunder the town. Part of that plunder might mean the women that live there. So you come in, you take over the town, you plunder the women, you rape them, sometimes the children. And then let's say the Syrian government takes over again. Well, now that the Syrian government's back, the people might come back. And this goes both ways. The anti-government and the government factions both did this. And they take it back. Well, your husband doesn't want you anymore because you've been raped. You're not worth anything to him. Or your children, you're no longer a virgin. So then you're brought to the same point. Sometimes you're killed. Sometimes you're just considered worthless. Sometimes you can't find a husband. There's no dowry. There's all these issues that come up. And so you as a woman or as a child may run away and may try to make your way to Israel. And because Israel, you might be destitute, you might be poor, you might have to sell your body, but at least you won't die. And Israel doesn't really know how to handle that very well. Another issue is women's rights. Now, I'm big on the issue of women's rights because Israel does have, among Middle East countries, more women's rights than any other country in the Middle East. But there's this thought, especially among the men in Israeli society, that, well, if a woman wants to be a prostitute, let her be a prostitute. My hands are clean of it. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that a majority of men in society consider prostitution fine and not something worth fighting. Especially if you look at the statistics of what kind of girls are being put in the sex trade, and boys. It's not just mostly girls, but not just boys. Another one is apathetic government. In the Knesset, it's a very complicated system because you don't really have one party in power. You might have a party with a majority, but they don't have enough votes to pass laws. And so you'll find that you have to work together with all these different parties, and they fight so much. The Israelis love to fight. And so they all fight with each other, and they have a hard time coming to consensus on issues. And so throughout the years, they really haven't done much to address trafficking up until 2001 when the State Department tip reports came out, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, I'm going to slow down a little bit. I'm trying to get through this quickly because I am going to do videos on those in more detail. But I want to hit home the importance of looking at-risk youth, not just in Israel, but also in America. In Israel, I first became aware of the problems with at-risk youth with a friend of mine, Shlomo, who was telling me about how there's so many children in Israel who have no place to go. They might have a place to sleep, but they'll get kicked out in the morning and they have to roam the streets all day long. And then I went actually at a restaurant. I was eating dinner at a restaurant. The server, she was asking me why I'm in Israel, and I was in a town called Mevaseret at the time. And she goes, well, during the day, I do social work. And she told me about how children, particularly the ages of 12 to 18, are kind of an unwanted group of people if they're troubled children. And so a lot of them turn to prostitution as a way to make money during the day. They can stay overnight in a hostel somewhere, but then they get kicked out in the morning. And that's their job until they turn 18 and they can go to the army. So the issue of at-risk youth in Israel is very important for people to address. They are starting to address it. NGOs like Atsum, like Isha Leisha, which is woman to woman, they're starting to address it. They're starting to advocate for better services for these children. But we see this in America too a lot, where children just aren't really taken care of. So I went through that really quickly because I wanted to get to the crux of what my research was. And that was, how did the United States tip reports affect Israel? David Tsur, who is on the subcommittee of trafficking in women and prostitution, he had an interview and he talked about this. And he talked about the reality was that without the whip of the State Department, Israel wouldn't have done much. And you see that throughout Israel's history. They usually have to be pressured to do something. Now, like I said, I'm a supporter of Israel and I love Israel. So I'm a little critical on them on this issue, but they do a lot of good things, especially for where they're living in the world. But so what happens to you as a country if you're rated tier 3 in the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report is you lose funding. This was instituted, I believe, by George Bush, his cabinet. And since 2001, they've been taking records of each country. And unless you have extenuating circumstances, you lose aid from the US. Israel didn't want that to happen. In 2001, they were ranked tier 3. And in 2001, they passed an anti-trafficking law. Now, they actually passed it before the tip report was finally published. My opinion, I don't have facts to back this up, but my opinion is they heard about what the ranking was going to be, and they tried to make a change before that happened. In 2002, they were moved up to tier 2, and in 2012, they were moved up to tier 1. So they've done a lot of good work. They just needed someone to kind of prod them along. This is what was said about Israel in 2001. that they are not meeting the minimum standards of trafficking, and they're not really doing much to fight it. In fact, trafficking was not illegal until this law passed in 2001. It was not specifically illegal to traffic women. So what happened? Well, they were tier 3. They passed this anti-trafficking law. In 2002, they were like, I wonder what's going to happen now. And they tried to make some minor changes. In 2003, they tried to get ahead of the game and pass another law, but that law didn't pass because of the factions in the government and a whole lot of other issues. But then in 2006, the United States said, you know, Israel, you made a good first step. We moved you up to tier 2, but you passed a law, but you haven't really prosecuted anybody. You haven't created services for victims. You haven't done much to protect people who are in marginalized situations. And so they moved Israel to what's called a 2-tier watch list, which means if you don't make change, you're probably going to be brought down to tier 3 again. So what does Israel do? They pass a law. They pass a law making much greater protections for victims, expanding services, and a number of other things. Now, I bring this up because in 2003, there was a switch in the Israeli mentality. When they got downgraded to the watch list, they decided to really make a stance and start making change and really drive results in their trafficking program. So from 2007 to 2011, they did a number of things to address issues of victim rehabilitation. They did a number of issues with shelters and with counseling services and with visas. So a lot of times before this 2006 law, you would just get deported. Now they would issue you a 1-year visa that you could use to work. You'd have a place to live for up to a year. You could bring your kids, and they even opened a shelter for men. The one stain that I still saw there was that they tried to pass an anti-prostitution law, but it didn't pass. It got close, but then the Knesset dissolved, and the new Knesset didn't have the votes. Then in 2012, Israel was upgraded to a tier 1 country. Now, there's a lot of reasons this happened. One was the finishing of the border fence. I really love this story, so I'm just going to digress a little bit. When the border fence along the Sinai border was finished, Israel and Egypt actually talked to one another. Israel said, we'll keep these terrorists from crossing the border, and you attack them from the other sides. The Egyptian army actually came and wiped out a number of these terror camps and set a number of victims free. And you can read about it. I'll talk about it in one of my videos. But it was an amazing example of how when two countries come together to fight trafficking and fight this type of abuse, they really can make a difference. There was also a lot of NGO involvement that started to happen. And now NGOs have always been involved, but they saw that Israel was starting to take a stand. They saw that Israel was moving in the right direction, and NGOs got on board. They started pressuring the government, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Many expanded services for victims, and it went just beyond if you were Jewish. So you can come in under a work visa to Israel for a year, and a lot of those people would be trafficked because they were in desperate situations, which is why they're on a work visa in Israel. So if you were non-Jewish, you could still get a 1-year visa. And they expanded these shelters to include job training, to include language and things like that. One of the things that is still an oversight in Israel is labor trafficking. They've dealt with sex trafficking to some degree, but labor trafficking is happening more and more now as immigrants are coming more and more to Israel to work. In fact, there was a story of this group of people in a boat. The owner of the boat, they were out fishing in the Mediterranean. The owner of the boat wouldn't let them off the boat, and he wouldn't pay them their salary. And what they did is they actually jumped out of the boat and swam to shore and talked to the Israeli officials. And the Israeli officials helped them get better, helped them, have shelter, but they never prosecuted the boat owner. So there's still some issues with labor trafficking. And again, the anti-prostitution law did not pass. There's just 3 parts of this triangle that is really happening in Israel that really excited me. First is that the Trafficking in Persons report was pushing the Knesset to make change. Second, the Knesset was responding to the US positively by passing these new laws. And then third, the NGOs on the bottom here, you'll notice the NGOs took a space on both sides. I really should put this arrow 2 ways, because not only were the NGOs talking to the US about, hey, here's some statistics that show Israel could do better. Here's some things that maybe Israel should focus on. They were also saying to the Knesset, hey, we're really happy about what you're doing, let us provide services. We're really happy about what you're doing, but have you thought about this? And in my meetings, I noticed a lot of NGOs were actually there and contributing to the subcommittee meetings, and the Knesset was actively listening to NGO input. So in Israel, they have this unique space to make a difference that has not been there before, but it's a combination of the US pressure and finally the Knesset wanting to make change. Now, before I go into what Israel could do more, I just want to mention something. Right now, in Israel, they're finishing what's called like Fallen Soldiers Day, and they're starting what's called Israel Independence Day. It's a period to, the first day they talk about how the death of the soldiers has caused Israel to be alive, and the second day is just to celebrate, kind of like our July 4th. I want to keep that in mind because it's a good example of how when people believe in something like Israel and all the soldiers died, they created the country. Israel is doing its best, I think, not its best, they're doing a lot of good work to fight trafficking. And I don't want anyone here to use these statistics or use this information to be anti-Semitic. Israel has work to do, but that's no excuse for any of these movements that are anti-Israel. I'm anti-boycott movement, I'm anti people who think that the Jewish state shouldn't exist, so just don't, I would appreciate it if you didn't use these statistics to spread evil. Now, what could Israel do better? The number one thing that Israel could do to make change is expand their definition of trafficking. And this is why Elisa Levy said trafficking has been eradicated in Israel. Their definition of trafficking is if you were kidnapped in a foreign country, brought to Israel for the purposes of prostitution, then you're a trafficking victim. Or if you were kidnapped in a foreign country and brought here to work, you're a trafficking victim. Let's say you're a tourist in Israel, you're kidnapped, locked up in a room, and used for sex. Well, technically you're not a trafficking victim. You've been sexually exploited, but you weren't kidnapped from a foreign country. In fact, there was an example in one of the research articles I read of a girl who had an apartment and she couldn't pay her rent. And the landlord said, well, you know, until you have more money, how about we just have sex once a week and that'll be your rent. Well, that's legal in Israel. So they made an agreement and that's legal. I'm not sure it should be legal, but it is legal. But then the month was up and she said, okay, I got a new job. I'm ready to start paying again. He said, well, you didn't pay me last month. So you owe me rent. So either keep having sex with me or I'm going to evict you. Israel said she was sexually exploited and the landlord had to pay a fine and recompense for what he did. But it wasn't considered a trafficking crime. In the international definition of trafficking is the moment that she went from having an agreement with him on sex to when he was forcing her through eviction, that would be trafficking. So the international definition is much more broad. You can look at it on the UN's website, but primarily it's if you're doing anything against your will, you're a victim of trafficking. So if you, by situation, by family life, by drug addiction, are being forced to do something you don't want to otherwise be doing, you're a trafficking victim. Second, Israel's mafia is very powerful, and you're not getting a lot of trafficking victims prosecuted. Israel needs to do more with that, particularly through educating the police and law enforcement on how to spot trafficking victims and how to properly prosecute crimes. And the last thing is, Israel really needs to address prostitution. You know, I walk through the streets of Tel Aviv by the bus stop, and you see these girls, I hate to say it, but these poor girls, they're sitting out there scantily clad, just looking for a client so that they can have enough money to shoot themselves up with heroin. There are some who are high scale, but they have to do something about prostitution in Israel. They've tried a number of times to pass a law, and there's a lot of support, but some of the more orthodox groups aren't on board with it because some of their members use prostitutes. But they really need to make a push. The Nordic model of anti-prostitution talks about it's not illegal to be a prostitute, it's illegal to pay for a prostitute. The point is to make sure that the women, children, and men who are prostitutes, probably because they are victims of circumstance, aren't being punished, but that if you are promulgating their victim status, if you're using them for whatever reason, then you get punished. So the goal is that they find victims and then they prosecute criminals at the same time. Or another law, just do something. I want Israel to do something. But like I said, Israel is doing better than many countries in the world. There were only 31 countries in 2014 ranked tier 1. 31. Israel is the only country in the Middle East ranked tier 1. And in fact, most of Israel's neighbors are ranked tier 3. Abhorrent human rights abuses, which is why there's a trafficking problem in Israel. You have women all over the Middle East who are being raped and abused and killed and murdered. And instead of dying, they think, well, I might be poor in Israel, I might be a prostitute in Israel, but at least I won't die. At least Israel has some level of human rights. So I also wanted to tie this into Minnesota in the US, and then I'll take questions. So this will just be short. In Minnesota, I looked up the statistics in 2013, and what can we do here? 2013, we ranked number 2 in the online sex solicitation of children. That's not good. Average age of a woman entering, now I hesitate to use the word woman at the age of 12 to 14, it really should be girl. Entering prostitution is 12 to 14. We're on the 13th on the FBI list of worst trafficking states. 89% of prostitutes who were surveyed said they didn't want to be a prostitute. However, there's some good news. In 2014, Minnesota passed what's called the Safe Harbor Law, which if you were a minor and you were picked up for prostitution, that you wouldn't be prosecuted as a prostitute, but that you'd be protected as a minor. And so there's a number of other protections, I believe, in that law as well. But we have some work to do. What about in the US? A lot of states, and even the federal government, talk a lot about wanting to deal with this trafficking issue because it's a hot topic, right? But what are we really doing? How many cities are picking up prostitutes and interviewing them to talk about, are you a prostitute, or they just throw them in jail overnight and release them the next morning? In fact, if you watched a documentary on, it's called A Path Appears, it talks about this issue. There were 2 things that really hit me on the Path Appears documentary. One was that if you were a prostitute and you got picked up, they just threw you in jail overnight and let you out the next morning without any talk with them about, are you a victim of trafficking? And the second thing was, there was a scene in the movie where they were in a hotel and the police set up a sting operation, and the men that came in to purchase the sex services were given a ticket. If they paid double the fine, they wouldn't send a letter home saying that they got a ticket for soliciting a prostitute. That was it. I just thought that was absolutely strange. I think we need to have tougher laws for people using sex and better enforcement. So one of the big issues that came up in my research was that border trafficking is a big problem, not just in Israel, but in the US. We have undocumented workers all over the US. And where concentrations of undocumented immigrants live, you find higher incidences of sexual exploitation and labor exploitation. In fact, I just heard a story recently about in the Dakota oil fields, they found a van full of women that they just put in a barn, and the guys would pay $20 to go have sex with them. And we need to deal with stuff like that. Now, I know immigration is a hot topic in the US. I'm not sure how to address it. I think it needs to be talked about, and there needs to be solutions. Minnesota, I'm going to tell you my worst story that I've heard. There's this new face of trafficking. It's really difficult now to throw a bunch of women on an airplane, bring them overseas, especially to countries like the US or Israel, and use them as prostitutes. So what happens now? I heard there's a friend of mine who works in an Indian reservation, and mail order bride service men go on these services, project themselves to be these great, wonderful guys. They get these South Americans or Russians to marry them, have this lovely family life, and have a child. Once they have a child, they hold the child ransom and make their wife go out and have sex with all their coworkers. This is particularly common in Minnesota. And you tell me, if you have a child being held ransom, are you going to tell the police? Are you going to tell anyone? Probably not. Probably not. Somehow we need to fight that. Somehow we need to figure out who these people are and look at places where you'd think trafficking doesn't exist, but perhaps it does. Perhaps it does. And it really does take all of us to make a difference. It takes every last one of us. If you think your neighbor is being victimized, or you think your neighbor is a criminal, each one of us in our communities has to stand up and make a difference. So what can we do? What can we do? First thing I'd advise, if you think somebody's a victim of trafficking, don't go up to them and try to rescue them, because you might die, or they might die, or both of you might die. A lot of times trafficking victims are watched by their pimps. That's one of the ways that they're held in fear, is knowing that the threat of death exists if they do something wrong. So what you can do is you can call the 24-hour hotline, and if you have trouble speaking English, that's fine. And this is for the US. I know Israel has, I forget the number, it's a hotline for migrant workers, I think is what it's called. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but you can Google it. So in the US, it's a multilingual hotline that you can call. It gives resources, it gives numbers to the FBI or to local law enforcement. It'll even they'll even have people come out and train your community on how to spot trafficking victims. For some information on the tip reports, and if you want to research a specific country. And the United States now, initially they didn't rank themselves, but now the US ranks themselves. There's a nonprofit called Polaris that ranks states based on tip report rankings. I'm really not keen on the Polaris rankings because they rank a lot of states tier 1 when, if you look at states, they're not doing a very good job. And the big thing I would say is donate to causes you care about, not just with your money, but with your time. It doesn't just take all of us talking, it takes all of us doing. Talk's great, but doing is better. So now that we're done, I know I went fast and I had a lot to talk about. But now that you have this information and this quote, God TV is a TV station in Israel, but I saw this quote and it makes sense to me, both to you who are in the room, to me, and to the people online. You may choose to look the other way, but now that you know, but you can never again say that you did not know. I would hope that you don't choose to look away, that you work towards making a difference in your communities, that you support the causes you care about, and at the end of the day, make sure that you're doing something. Do something to end trafficking. And then now we'll take questions. For those of you online, it's going to take about a minute lag before you even hear this. So it'll take us a while if you have questions. But any questions in the room or any discussion points, things you want to talk about? Come on, just ask questions. Yes, sir.
As minor are the tip report rankings themselves, are they simply quantitative of that X amount of arrests or X amount of laws that gets you to tier 2 or tier 1? I guess what goes into the rankings themselves?
That's a good question. So there's a number of issues that go into the rankings. First, let me explain what the rankings are. Tier 1 means that you're trying your best to fight trafficking or you're trying hard to fight trafficking. Tier 2 means you're addressing the issue. Tier 3 means you're not addressing the issue and you really don't care about it. So to move from tier 3 to tier 2 is relatively easy. Pass some sort of a law that outlaws forms of trafficking. You don't have to make a lot of arrests. You just have to do something legal, legislatively, to make trafficking legal. To go from tier 2 to tier 1, though, is a little bit different. They do look at statistics, like quantitative data on how many arrests did you make. In fact, that's one of the big criticisms of Israel, is their statistics don't show a lot of arrests. But it also goes into what kind of services are you providing for victims. Not only are you providing them, are they using them? Some of that's statistical, some of that's through, they'll actually go and survey the shelters or they'll go meet with the government and talk to them about it. So I don't know about all states, but I know in Israel that one of the meetings I went to was actually going over the tip report, and the US Embassy in Tel Aviv is very involved with both finding numbers and ensuring that those numbers are accurate, and then transmitting that to the US, as well as talking with Israel about how they can further strengthen their anti-trafficking laws and services. So the way they're formatted, the tip reports do what's called the 3 Ps: protection, prosecution, and prevention. And they have measurements in each one of those categories that they're looking at to see if you're making a difference. Does that answer your question?
We do have actually a question from online.
Ooh!
Yeah, this is from Michael.
Hi, Michael.
And it says the U.S. has a very large exploitation trafficking problem, but most U.S. citizens are oblivious to it. In general, do you think Israeli citizens are as oblivious to their trafficking issues as U.S. citizens are?
Do I think Israeli officials are as oblivious, or Israeli citizens are as oblivious as Americans? Yes. But the one thing that makes them a little bit more convoluted is that they don't really care that women want to be prostitutes. They think that if a woman wants to be a prostitute, let her. Whereas here we kind of, from a moral standpoint, we kind of say, well, we don't really like prostitution. It might be legal, but most of us don't like it. Where our disconnect, I from my opinion, in the US is our disconnect is saying that prostitution is trafficking, yes, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. We also have things like pornography that we deal with, and our desensitization among like just different types of movies and such. But yeah, I'd say Israel has the same process, same problem, maybe a little bit worse because prostitution is legal there for the most part. But yeah.
I guess I have a follow-up question
Sure.
to that. Is prostitution more visible in the streetscape in the environment that you were in? Because I know it depends on the neighborhood and
Right.
A lot of other things.
So in Tel Aviv, particularly, if you go to Tel Aviv, you actually will be handed flyers, or you'll find them on the ground, similar to Las Vegas, I've heard. So you can pick up just prostitution solicitations with a scantily clad woman. Hey, if you want to have sex with me tonight, call this number. So yeah, it's very in your face in some communities. Now in Jerusalem, not so much. I would say where you'll find it more is in some of the border towns. Eilat, Tel Aviv, Haifa, like if they're on the water or on the border. Tveria probably has an issue. But I spent most of my time in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and in Tel Aviv, that was definitely the case, that people were so desensitized to prostitution because they were all over the place. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did you do any research about the health aspects and consequences of this, like HIV and STDs? How
No,
the government is looking at that?
I did do research on health outcomes, but not specific to STDs. Trying to think if I know anything about it. I do know that, well, I can make some assumptions. My assumption would be that so prostitution is estimated to be a $2 billion industry in Israel, and it's not regulated by the government. It's not very well regulated by the government. And so it would not be unusual for me to think that a lot of these women have STDs. And if you choose not to use protection as a client, you're probably going to get an STD also. So, no, I don't know of anything else besides that. But my assumption is it's probably a big problem. What else? Anything else in
I
there?
have a
Yes, sir.
question. Israel in the neighbors. When you said that at least Israel is doing better than their neighbors, I think, isn't that like a way to say, yes, at least we're doing something and our Islamic neighbors are doing nothing? So that may be like, we're good instead of we can do more?
Oh, so the question is, so if we say that we're doing better than our neighbors, are we using that as an excuse not to do more? Yes. And I think it's a big problem. I don't think we should rank ourselves. Now, could I say unequivocally that they're doing that? No, I can't say that, but I can say that it's my opinion anyway that some Israeli Knesset members say, well, we're doing better. We're tier one. We're doing better than everyone else, so we don't need to do anything more. I don't know if that's really the majority in the Knesset anymore. It was a few years ago, but I don't know if it would be now. Because you have.
I didn't, I'm sorry, this has already been asked, you said, is there a segment of women in Israel that you're talking about, are they Russian immigrants or whatever? And also, again, I apologize if you already answered this, what about Israel struck your attention rather than all the other countries in the world?
Okay, the first question was, am I focusing on a specific group of women?
No, in terms of prostitution, is it a specific group?
Oh, in terms of prostitution.
Many migrant groups and immigrant groups, the Russians in the 70s, the Georgians, the Ethiopians. So,
Well, 90s it used to be the Russians. I didn't focus on any specific group of people, but the face of prostitution was generally Russians in the 90s. Now from what I know, it's more multifaceted. And one of the big problems is you have all these different people from all these different countries, and you can't talk to them because if you don't speak their language and they don't know the language, that was one of the complications I ran into, is law enforcement didn't know what to do with these people that spoke all these strange languages. Now, Russian they knew, but right now there's a lot of Eritreans and Ethiopians that are in prostitution. There's a lot of Egyptians. There's a lot of other Africans. So the one thing in the prostitution laws, they've now made it illegal for a non-Israeli to be a prostitute. Doesn't help. I mean, they don't enforce it, but you're technically not supposed to be a prostitute if you're not an Israeli citizen. No, it was just, oh, why did I choose Israel? So there's really three reasons I chose Israel. One is I have some Jewish blood in my family. I love Israel, and I wanted to see what they were doing. Second, when I did research in the TIP reports, Trafficking in Persons report, they moved from being a tier 3 country to a tier 1 country. And third, because they're a Middle East country, and I wanted to focus on Middle East trafficking, and I was a little bit scared to go to any of the other countries because I have an Israeli stamp on my passport. So the other country I looked at was Jordan. I thought it'd be interesting to see what Jordan is doing because I shouldn't say Israel's doing so much better than their neighbors. They are doing better than their neighbors, but there are some Middle East countries besides Israel trying to do things. So I shouldn't be unfair about that.
I think a point to make when you're talking about the health of the women is that Israel generally has a free or almost free unilateral health delivery system. So I would think health impact, and while bad, might be mitigated by the fact that they would have access to it.
So the comment was the fact that Israel has a primarily free healthcare system, that's a benefit?
Well, I'm saying, somebody asked a question on the health of the women impacted in trafficking. And when you speak of health altogether, I mean, here in this country, it costs a lot of money to go see a doctor. That might be a ban, not a ban, but a barrier. But in a country that has almost universal health care,
Right. Although
that's all.
so when I was in Israel, I got pneumonia, and I didn't get free universal health care because I'm not an Israeli citizen. So and a lot of the prostitutes can't prove they're citizens because all of that documentation's been taken away. So yes, they have free health care for citizens, but I had to pay $500 to get my pneumonia drugs. Well, I take that back. It was $250 for the pneumonia drugs and then $250 for something else. But the actual going to the hospital. Yes.
So a couple things. Questions are blowing up over here. So I've got
really?
4 of them.
Woo woo!
Yeah.
Thanks everyone that I planted questions with. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
But also one follow-up note to the health outcomes. I don't know I can't speak to what happens in other countries, but I do know that often a point of pride for sex workers is that they often do ensure that they have regular STI checkups and that they're clean. And they will often say, I'm probably cleaner than the chick that you just met at the bar, kind of thing. And people often pay more for sex without a condom. That's currency. So just to complicate that a little bit.
Yeah, another thing on that note is one of the interventions I think might help in many countries is when women well, I don't know how you do it because you don't want to just ask a woman, hey, are you a prostitute? But a woman you are pretty sure is a prostitute, when they go to the hospital, have a list for nurses or doctors to ask, because it's a safe place. They're in a safe place in the hospital. Do you need help? Is somebody forcing you to do this against your will? Some basic questions, and then a way out for them, right? Because if you go approach them on the streets, that can be dangerous. But in a hospital setting, they're probably not going to have their pimp with them. That might be one intervention to think about. So what else on there?
All right, 2 questions are similar. So I'll ask them together, and they're both about the Swedish or Nordic model, which is decriminalization of sex work, but criminalizing the purchase. So would the U.S. ever consider the Swedish model? And also, how important is it for Israel to think about the Nordic model?
I mean, do you know if U.S. would consider the Nordic model? I don't know.
That would be very difficult.
So would the U.S. consider the Nordic model? I would say no, because in their mind, they have already outlawed prostitution, and they think the U.S. would be more willing, I think. Now remember, we're a nation of states, so it's really the states that would probably do something more than the federal government, would be my guess. But states are starting to get on board with creating services for prostitutes besides just throwing them in jail overnight. But I don't really know if the U.S. or if certain states would consider a Nordic model. And then what about Israel?
Is, I guess, the same thing, feasibility for Israel to consider the Nordic model?
Yeah, Israel actually has considered the Nordic model a couple of times. In fact, I think the most recent one was 2009. And it actually passed the preliminary reading. And then it passed the first 1 or 2 readings in the Knesset, in the parliament. But then the parliament dissolved because of elections. So they didn't get a chance to pass it. Now, I know they also, when I was in Israel over the summer, they had preliminary readings on the law, and they couldn't get it out of committee. It got stuck in committee over see if I can remember. I think it got stuck in committee over, it was some tidbit of information by the Orthodox about, I forget, but it got stalled in committee, and it was a religious thing that happened. So unfortunately, they're still talking about it, but it hasn't been passed. Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. What else?
So next question, and then we will switch back and forth. What role does corruption within the Israeli police and court systems or lawmakers play in preventing change?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a huge amount of corruption in the Israeli government, police force, and in the court system. Although I will tell you, the court system and the higher up levels anyway is still pretty legit. In fact, the Jerusalem Institute of Justice, they've done a lot of good work through the court system to provide rights for people that have failed in other avenues. So I would specifically point out the JIJ for doing good work. And from what I know about the court system, yeah, there's elements of corruption, but like I said, compared to other Israeli systems, they're probably one of the best. The police, however, are a whole different ballgame. There is a lot of corruption. I don't know how deep it runs. There's also a level of, now this is going to make my NGO friends a little bit mad. But when I was sitting in Knesset meetings, the one thing that really surprised me was, so yes, the police are corrupt, and I don't really know what to do about it, except the Knesset needs to do a better job of fighting police corruption. But in these Knesset meetings, the NGOs were kind of timid about really fighting with the government. The only time there was a fight was when there was an Arab MK. There were 3 kids who had been kidnapped, and the Arab parliament member had said that the people who kidnapped them were freedom fighters. And all the Israelis were up in arms and yelling at her. But then we sat down to talk about prostitution in Israel, and they were all very timid. And I thought, this is not the Israeli way. Israelis like to talk to each other and talk loud. And so I wonder, and this is just my opinion, I wonder if there's a little bit of fear of losing funding if they complain too much or criticize the government too much. And that's why I think it's up to us citizens to make sure we donate to the causes we care about, so they don't have to be afraid of government funding, because a lot of the services that are provided in Israel might be given by NGOs, but some of that funding comes from the Knesset. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and I think the NGOs are doing a good job of navigating the dynamic, but it is one. What was it? Any questions in the room? Any more in there?
There's one more.
Okay.
So it says, you mentioned the Jewish and Islamist extremist views and perspectives on sex trafficking. What are the responses of mainline Christians, Jewish and Muslim groups to combat sex or human trafficking?
What are the mainline responses of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim groups to combat trafficking? Is anyone a Muslim in the room? Because I don't really know the Muslim response, but I know the Christian and Jewish response. If you look in the southern part of the United States, you'll see a lot of faith-based organizations, Christian faith-based organizations, doing good work to fight trafficking. Now, what's really funny about this is Jews and Christians use the same scripture verse. It's Isaiah 58, and it talks about releasing the shackles of those in bondage. And so Jews and Christians together both agree that we need to fight trafficking. And they both agree that it's the job of those who believe in a higher power to do something about it. So mainstream, yes, it's a very limited number of ultra-Orthodox Jews and ultra-Orthodox Muslims that use the prostitution services or that in the Muslim side kill their children, but it's still a large enough number that it's promulgating the sex trade. And now, I didn't mention this, but the Jewish ones, they actually try to find Gentile prostitutes because some of them believe Gentiles, and a Gentile means you're not a Jew. Gentiles don't have souls, in their opinion. So it's better to have sex with a Gentile because she doesn't have a soul anyway. Yeah, a little corny, isn't it?
Sorry?
A little weird, isn't it?
I guess I just have never, I lived in Israel for 2 years, in Jerusalem, and I guess I never once heard anybody who was Jewish, either Orthodox, mainstream, whatever, talk about anybody not having a soul. Perhaps that has happened in the years since I lived there, but I find that
Hard to believe?
I find it hard to believe, and I would be wondering who you were talking to who might have said that.
Well, so I've talked to a number of people. I'll tell you a little story. I was on the bus. You know, I love to talk to people, which you could probably tell by now. I love to talk. And there was a guy sitting next to me who was reading an old, I think it was Ernest Hemingway, some old book, Adams, maybe, I forget who it was, but he was reading an old English book, and I'm like, do you speak English? He's like, yeah. And he was a new immigrant, only there for a year. he asked what I was there for, and I said, well, I'm doing this research project on human trafficking. He goes, oh, really? My rabbi just talked about prostitution. I said, really? Yeah, he said that if I ever want to go to a prostitute, it's okay, but I have to give her a get. And a get is when you give payment. So a get is a divorce certificate. It means that you, in some traditions, you exchange money or exchange goods for getting divorced. And so his rabbi said, go ahead, use the prostitutes if you want, but make sure you give her something of value, and then you have to say, I wash my hands of you. I have not.
I really must intervene here, because I know firsthand what a get is, and it does not involve an exchange of money. It is the Jewish form of divorce.
No,
It really
I
does.
totally agree. Totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. And I'd say 90% of Jews in Israel would agree with you. But some of the ultra-Orthodox sects that are trying to allow their men to use prostitutes when their wives are nida, before they've been through the purification process, that's what they're saying. That's how they're getting around the rule of, so okay, you might be married when you had sex with her, but just give her a get, and for the get to be to fulfill the requirement, you have to give her something of value. Like, it's more complicated than that, but that's what they're saying.
Yes, it has to be signed by 3 rabbis, so.
Not in their case.
All right.
He makes a statement, as long as she agrees with it, that's what they say.
There's one more question on
Good question, by the way. And you're right. So in case I'm coming across this way, I'm not at all against Judaism. I'm not at all against Israel. I love Israel. I care about Israel. And I don't think, and Jews don't think that way. But there are a few ultra-Orthodox sects that use, and there's some of them are even anti-Zionistic because the Messiah hasn't come. And so, in their opinion, the Messiah hasn't come, so they don't believe that Israel should be a nation yet. So there's a lot of corny things out there. Yeah, what was that?
So a follow-up question about the Nordic model. They're asking if you believe that the Nordic model is a crucial way to change trafficking or prostitution, or might there be a different alternative?
I actually think it's not a very good way to fight trafficking, at least in how it's implemented, because so the question was, is the Nordic model a crucial way of fighting trafficking? And I'll say I don't think it's a crucial way, because the Nordic model has a lot of problems. I think it's a good first step. But for instance, when you're involved in the Nordic model, what if the person goes into your house, you guys have sex, then he comes out, and it's hard to prove that they're having sex. He has to actually admit he had sex with you for it to be a crime. So while it does punish the people who purchase sex services, it only punishes the people who purchase sex services and are willing to say they've purchased sex services. And in a lot of communities where they're enforcing these laws, they're not then going into the house and talking to the victims, because the victims are like, no, we're just friends. So the victims are still scared. I think it's a good first step, but I don't think it's a crucial step. I think what's a crucial step is passing something that outlaws prostitution while at the same time protecting victims. And the Nordic model is a good first step, but there's still some work they could do on that.
We've got about 2 minutes left. If there are any additional questions?
I don't know if you saw, I think it's in today's paper, a DHS, Minnesota DHS official, Mr. Toogood, arrested for trafficking, participating in trafficking.
Mr. Too Good got arrested for trafficking because he's not too good.
I need to look this up to see what the story is, but apparently it wasn't just soliciting prostitution, it was involved with a trafficked person.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'll just end with this. I have a friend who does social work, and there was a client that was married as a child overseas. And when they came to the US, they considered that girl to be kidnapped, not to be trafficked, even though she had been legally married at a very young age, and the man was married to her, so he, of course, had his rights to sex. He was raping her, really. And they considered her kidnapped. They didn't consider her a trafficking victim.
Minnesota just had a big trafficking ring that some years ago, right? It wasn't that long ago that we had a very high-profile case of a trafficking ring operating out of the Twin Cities. And I'm sure there's a lot more of it than we are aware of.
So let me just end by saying hi, everyone, again. Those are some really good questions you guys asked, and I don't really have all the answers, and I really believe that these dialogues are important. But let's dialogue, yes, but let's also do, let's also act. So make sure as we go about our days, we don't just think about it, we don't just talk about it, we actually do something about it. And thanks for your time. See you guys later.